Hi. So, word selfishness has been on my mind for a couple of days now. I actually started to make some notes the other day, and then I put it away and decided I didn't want to work on it right now. I had other things I would rather do. So in my selfishness, I refused to talk to you about selfishness. I seem to be experiencing a pretty consistent theme nowadays, you think? I better focus on that. So selfishness has been popping around in my head. So I did some work around that. Got a few pages of notes. I'm always going to have notes from now on. It's just the way it's going to have to be. So as I mentioned the other day, I'm only going to address things that I've seen an area of relevance amongst the channels I follow and others within the class over on Maverick's page, because we're not all on both pages. So one of the words in the preview of the class, the list of words he gave us to self-define, was the word selfishness. So the first thing I did was just, your basic, simple, what does it mean in the dictionary? Which isn't always what it means, but it's a good place to start. So in this particular case, it came out that selfishness is seeking or concentrating on one's own advantage, pleasure, or well-being without regard for the same for others. When Maverick was addressing the words he indicated for his definition, he had kind of called it gimme, 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 which is a very blatant and obvious description of selfishness. I want more. It's about me. It's what I want. Do what I say. So gimme, gimme, gimme was a relevant and applicable definition for selfishness as he had described it. But I wanted to go into more depth on that from my end, for what my work, because I'm not the facilitator that's already done the work. I'm a person doing the work, so I needed to actually dig in and do my own work. So right off the top, I was able to provide myself with some pretty blatant examples of selfishness that I see in the world, hear, experience, feel, things like that, just in everyday life. So for example, taking the last of something, knowing another also desires it without finding a compromise. Taking the last dinner roll while somebody else is reaching for it and laughing and saying, I'm taking it. Basic kid stuff. Demanding more than your own fair share when there's others that want some too. Requesting all of the prime holidays and summer vacation days off at work every year when there's others that also would like that. Just blatant examples of selfishness that most of us have probably dealt with at some time or another in our lives. Or perpetrated in many cases. I've perpetrated great deals of selfishness in my life. But then I was thinking, I've got some feelings and experiences of my own where I felt that somebody was being selfish towards me, but it wasn't very blatant. It was more subtle. So I started thinking about examples of subtle selfishness. And in trying to figure out subtle selfishness, I kind of had to figure out how did I feel in that moment that would make me think something would be selfish, because it's not so obvious. So in pondering on that, I came up with a few things. The first one I came up with was expectations of another person are a subtle selfishness, because any expectation put upon another is a demand for them to fulfill some personal unmet need or desire according to the manner dictated by the expectation. So in doing that, that demand nullifies the chosen response of the one upon whom the expectation is being placed. Doing that demand erases the identity and preferences of that person and replaces them with your own, the person making the expectation. That demand attempts to force another into a power and control dynamic, subjecting them to the demands of the expector. So that sounds a little bit selfish. This demand also ignores and devalues the thoughts, perceptions, feelings, desires, reasons, and needs of the other person. The expectation attempts to limit the options available to those only included within the expectation, which is the perceptions available by the person making the expectation. So it's driven completely by their own their own perceptions. So expectation is an example of seeking or concentrating on one's own advantage. And they're seeking or concentrating on one's own advantage is being done through the control and manipulation and demands being put upon another to fulfill the needs. So expectation is pretty deep. It's come up a lot through most of the lessons. Pretty consistently that expectation is problematic behavior. So then I was thinking in more social environments where it might be even less obvious, or it might just be, tradition or something like that. Because, those are never full of selfishness, not at all. So demanding or coercing family or friends to celebrate major holidays and be involved in practices and celebrations that are contrary to their own preferences, and offering no compromise, collaboration, or choice option that also meets their own preferences and desires. That happens a lot. It happens all over the world a few times a year at different gatherings where, somebody's got it all planned out. This is exactly how it's going to go. And then when something goes wrong, it's a big old calamity and a big old family meltdown because all of the demands and expectations that were wrapped up in selfishness around what they wanted everybody else to do. So yeah, there's a lot of selfishness in tradition. Demanding the full attention of others to participate in practices and celebrations with which they do not agree is ego-driven narcissism. This demand imposes upon their own personalized belief system. And it doesn't give any room for any differentiation between any difference or varying thought. That demand requires that they agree with the beliefs and practices of another without any personal input, which is never going to be a pleasant situation. The demand devalues and minimizes the needs, desires, and practices of every other person associated with them. It eliminates any needs, practices, or desires that they themselves have for that holiday or event. And it fails to acknowledge, recognize, or respect the person's beliefs and is an attempt to supersede said person's beliefs and the reasons for them with the beliefs of someone else for no relevant reason at all. Demands upon the sacred time of others is an example of seeking and concentrating on one's own pleasure. And that's a hard one. I'm sitting here in public putting that out into the universe as a member of a very large family with some pretty significant family traditions and a no alcohol rule. So imagine that, right? This one was, it happens a lot. I see it in families all the time. I hear it around the office. It's pretty consistent in the world today. And we don't really think about what we're doing to people when we do it. Continuing to tell, share, or show something to another person after they have indicated that they don't wish to see, hear, or know it. I witness and hear this all day long. This level of narcissistic disrespect may actually cause or trigger trauma in some people and borders on emotional and psychological assault. This assault of the mind forcibly plants undesired data into the universe of another being. It assumes that the one being assaulted with the unreconciled data will not suffer adverse effects from that data. It permanently embeds data response to both the assault and the data received in the psyche of the receiver that will forever feed future interactions, perceptions, responses, and boundaries between them and form resentments in the receiver. This assumes that there is no good reason that anyone would have for not wanting that information that they've asked not to have. That data assault assumes that the desire of the person to share the information is all that is needed to authorize its sharing without the receiver being allowed any choice about receiving it. It's very aggressive and psychologically damaging and assaultive behavior. And I see damage and trauma from it between children and parents and systems and families and professionals and colleagues all the time. Because those boundaries are not respected and people don't just walk away. Well, I don't want to hurt their feelings. Well, are they hurting your feelings? Come on now. Walk away. Oversharing, unwanted sharing, is an example of seeking or concentrating on one's own well-being without regard for the same for others. And it's potentially dangerous, especially with vulnerable people with psychological traumas. Selfishness is an attempt to rule the kingdom of another by dictating to them their level of acceptance and importance. It's an aggressive and dominating method of getting one's own needs met outside of cooperation or collaboration of others. Through selfish behaviors, decisions, and interactions, it is shown that the selfish person perceives themselves as powerless, alone, and untrusting of others to consider their needs important. So they focus primarily on themselves and their own needs to elevate their perceived importance in the world and the power with those with whom they associate. Most of us know blatant selfishness and we easily recognize it. But what about subtle selfishnesses? It's been a very long day. My sister is incredible at getting things done quickly and productively, and y'all, she worked me today. I am exhausted. And still, the word selfishness is floating around and I have to get this work done. So it was time to get it done. So I wanted to really understand this word. Not the surface line of words strung together by Webster, but really understand this word so I can recognize it going forward and take actions to change those behaviors that I might have in myself. So I kind of broke it down to look at what it really means. So you know the word self, a person's essential being, or our ego. It's a noun. The suffix ish means having the qualities or characteristics of. The suffix ness means denoting a state or condition. So English is a intensely weak and lacking language, and as you may have just perceived, that whole word is put together backwards. Because if we put it together in the right order, it takes on an entirely different meaning. Denoting the state or condition of having the qualities or characteristics of a person's essential being or ego. Let me read that for you again. Denoting the condition of having the characteristics of ego. Denoting the state of having the qualities of self. Kind of gives it a different meaning when you put it that way, huh? So everything that you've heard tonight, what does the word selfishness now mean to you? Can you identify subtle selfishnesses in your world? How might you learn to recognize and combat selfishness both with the world and others with whom you interact, but also in yourself? How might the recognition of selfishness reignite one's perception of their own power? Just some things to think about going into preparing your own definition of the word selfishness and what it means to you. Recognizing our own selfishness is critical to living outside the flesh. The meat suit is selfish. The spirit is love. Light your spirit and live from your heart. Chainsaw the ego. Eliminate selfishness. Be love. Good night, y'all.